Back again. Puppy was just had a brief thing, so I'm coming right back to finish this up. But though this will be so, I'll label them completion of digestion 1 and completion of digestion 2 for your viewing pleasure, everybody. So now, as we go back and look again at the PowerPoint, we only have really one more area of consequence: the large intestine. It's we're talking about maybe 2.5 inches or so in typical diameter. The unique features are features that, and really, again, it's non-essential. So what is it doing in there? I mean, it's useful, but we can supplement for that in other areas. It produces, I mean, there's a certain amount of clotting enzymes, a bigger part of vitamin K based clotting factors. There's a certain amount of fluid and electrolyte balancing. There's a certain amount of B vitamins, all of which you could deal with if the colon was non functional or absent. So that's what makes it non-essential. It's kind of large, and certainly, like anything else, you'd rather have it than not have it. And it surrounds the small intestine. So it starts at the ileocecal valve, and the first section, because the sections are very distinctive, has its own name. It's called the cecum. That's where they get the name ileo for the ileum to the cecum, ileocecal valve. Protruding somewhat downward but somewhat centrally is a structure in the cecum that you're all familiar with. It kind of spirals a little bit like a twisty pretzel. That is what's called the vermiform, vermiform, worm-like appendix. And most of us, the current belief, and we're pretty sure about this, it houses a lot of bacteria that when people do have diarrhea or colitis or a gastrointestinal problem, it recedes the gut, sort of stores bacteria and then recedes it to facilitate its activity. That's most likely what it does. The trouble is things can get trapped in there. Sometimes people are more prone to it structurally. It can happen at any age, but typically it happens when people are younger rather than older. It happens to people who are fairly prominent. Notably, I mean, Ben Roethlisberger had one of those after he had already won his first of 2 Super Bowls. I think it happened a year or so afterwards. These are the kinds of things that you get. So it's not unusual. That's there. Current theory is probably more to keep it than to remove it. The big problem is if it needs to be removed and it ruptures. Now, typically, you have a situation where that will release that bacteria into what would be a sterile area within the peritoneal cavity, and that's where peritonitis comes from. That's why it becomes a surgical emergency. So the 3 things that identify are unique to it. Tinea coli, which means the tendon of the coli. It's really not a tendon as much as 3 bands of smooth muscle that sort of surround and sort of appear on all aspects of the colon that kind of hold its positioning, because it goes up, it goes across, it goes down, and it kind of curves in, as you will see shortly. These individual sections are called haustrum. Haustra is multiple. Haustrum would be the singular. That are really caused by the contraction of this Tinea coli, and they have these little pouches of fatty tubs that look like raindrops or teardrops called epiploic appendages. Those are unique. You should know all of those. The Tinea coli holds it in place. The haustra, the name for the section. We don't even know what the epiploic appendages do. So it starts at the cecum. That's the only one that's named, and you can see the appendix. Again, recolonizing the gut, the twisted shape, and the blockages. The colon, after the cecum, starts to go up. It's called the ascending colon. Then it bends. It basically makes roughly a 90-degree turn. We call it the hepatic flexure because it's close to the liver. Then it goes across. That's transverse colon, above the small intestine. Then it goes down at the spleen, the splenic flexure, and forms a descending colon. And then as it gets down sort of at the end of where the small intestinal area is, it kind of makes an S curve and goes in and goes somewhat centrally to form the sigmoid colon. And the S means because it makes a sigmoid for an S curve. So you have the right and then the left flexures, hepatic and splenic respectively, the descending and then the sigmoid. And the sigmoid, when it bends in and then starts to straighten out, now we start to get into constricted areas called the rectum, which is designed, as you can see, to make sure feces passes, and when somebody expels gas, they don't end up with feces passing inadvertently. And then finally gives way to the anus. And so you're going to see the simple columnar all the way until you get to the anal area. Then, because now the fecal material is so abrasive, potentially, that we see stratified squamous non keratinizing. There's sphincters that are normally there internal, the external is skeletal muscle, which we voluntarily control, until you have to go to the bathroom, more or less. And this is what it looks, classic picture, and you'll see this on the exam. Small intestines are in here, not pictured. You can see the descending or abdominal aorta and its division into the iliac vessels that are there. So you can see the appendix, which is somewhat down, and that's why a lot of times it'll go toward the umbilicus, and you'll feel umbilical pain with appendicitis. The yellow are the epiploic appendages. The tinea coli, there's typically 3 strips of these, and you can see where they go. And there's little areas, again, if you go back and look, where some of these flexures are at least partially retroperitoneal. It's sort of, they're tiny points of stabilization, not a lot. That so there's really limited areas that you see are there. And this is, now we're looking down at the anal area, these grooves that are there, veins that are sort of flatten out. And so, and this is where hemorrhoids come from, which are associated with obesity, with pregnancy, uh, with anal intercourse or anal trauma, a variety of things, and more common than you think that are there. And you can see the valves that are there, and that's what they're called, the hemorrhoidal veins. Okay, and you can see the cecum, appendix, and rectum are retroperitoneal. Okay, the colon retroperitoneal, except for the transverse and sigmoid. So the stable points are the ascending and descending. And then you have a variety of little sheets called mesocolon. Not a big deal for us to know. I'm just showing you some of this stuff. It's there. And it kind of gives you an idea where you can see the small intestine that's there, and you can see the omentum. And you can start looking through this if you're so interested. Again, anything is back, whether it's the bladder or the ureters or the kidney up there and things like that, are going to see are more retroperitoneal. Here's the appendicitis that are there. Not enough to just basically, now we don't see the folds and the villi or all the secretions. There are crypts with mucus and goblet cells and things like that. But again, the function is more about really absorbing water. If it goes through too fast, then you don't get a chance to reabsorb enough water, diarrhea. If it goes through too slow, absorbs too much water, gets hard, constipation. And again, a certain amount of finalizing electrolytes, a certain amount of B vitamins, and working on vitamin K for clotting factors. That's what you see. That's really what you have to know with regard to that. There's a ton of different bacteria in the lab. When you're looking at E. coli or Enterobacter or Proteus, this is where they come from. They're normally gut bacteria, Klebsiella pneumonia, which we'll talk about, or you will be. I would anticipate you'll be talking about either in lab or in micro lab rather. And again, fermentation. It's there. Vitamin synthesis B and K, pathogenic bacteria. There's a lot of sampling that goes on. There's a lot of health implications for that. There's a lot of problems. C. diff and VRE are big problems that are there. And that's really it. The interesting part, okay, is you can remove a colon. When I was in high school, the girl that I dated, and we didn't reconnect as much as we spoke with each other. Lo, those many years, 20 years ago, uh, as I recall. I think it was roughly 2003 when I must have Googled my name and found me in Chatham. And what had happened, and she had ulcerative colitis, which is a very nasty autoimmune disease, had to have her whole colon removed. And so they basically pulled down her, they call it a J pouch. They basically pull down the jejunum and create a pouch like area that effectively functions like the colon does. Crazy, crazy. I mean, she lives out in California. I don't know what's happened to her since I haven't spoken to her since those 20 years that are there. So there's a lot of things that are part of this. This is the one that should be noteworthy: diverticula. It's it's again, a herniation is an outpouching. So this is another kind of an outpouching, except this, the particularly as you get older. The smooth muscle weakens, and some of the mucosa, some of the lining kind of pouches out like a bubble in a tire would. And it's called a diverticulum. It's not the only the gut happens, happens in the bladder as well. I have one of those. So when it's the condition is called diverticulosis in the sigmoid colon. Half people over 70. This is very common. This is one of those things why they look so closely with colonoscopies, and you're seeing all this thing about Cologuard and looking for blood in the stool because very often little polyps or precancerous lesions form that have to be addressed. And because that's maybe the third most common cancer, that lethal cancer, let's put it like that. So after maybe lung cancer and prostate cancer, we're dealing with in lung cancer and breast cancer in women, lung cancer and prostate cancer in men. Gut cancers are significant problems. It affects a lot of us. And when it gets inflamed, if they rupture, if they leak, if stool gets in, it's called diverticulitis. And that can be a real problem. Irritable bowels. So a lot of people suffer with that. And basically, that's everything for the rest of the gut. I'm not doing the physiology. So I will subsequently send you this lecture along with the other one and get in touch with you regarding what we're going to be doing on Wednesday of next week, which I guess it's the 5th. All right. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.